Joanne, I'm so pleased that you've joined me today. I want to jump right in because this election is like no other in my lifetime. Certainly, you probably agree with me, but you have spent decades in both journalism and politics. What was the turning point that convinced you Canada's electoral system needed not just reform, but a full-on voting revolution?
It came at me slowly. I left journalism to go into politics because as a journalist, I stayed nonpartisan. I felt like, I kept my opinions to myself. I was always working to find out sort of what was going on and trying to get information out. But at the 2015 elections, Stephen Harper was threatening to get rid of the CBC. And I had worked for the CBC for 20 years. I had taught a course on public broadcasting. I believed a public broadcaster, love or hate the CBC, but a public broadcaster was critical to democracy. And I thought, I can't stay quiet anymore. So, naivete is wonderful. I just jumped out into the deep end and ran in the 2015 election. And I discovered so much about the political system inside workings that shocked me. I mean, I had covered politics for 40 years. I thought I knew about how the financing worked, about the party structures. I didn't. Parties keep their internal structures kind of quiet. So that's where the heart of this story starts. There were two events that happened in that campaign that just blew me away. And I thought, I've got to write about this. Well, it took me, 4 years to write this book and another 4 to kind of get myself ready to write it. So it's because I'd been in newsrooms and what I would say are back rooms, I felt I brought a perspective about voting and about democracy that I wanted to share.
I think we're going to have to come back to that CBC part in a little bit
Okay.
because there has been some tension about the CBC in this election cycle that I think we should circle back on. But as we're heading into what many see as the most consequential election in Canadian history,
Yes.
Trump is threatening tariffs, even joking, and I'm putting joking in quotations here about annexation, which is invasion as far as I'm concerned. So do you think this could be the thing that finally drives voter turnout, or will it push people deeper towards cynicism?
This is my worry, and this is why I am taking every opportunity to say to people, vote, just vote. Almost 12 million Canadians who were eligible to vote didn't vote in the last federal election. It's 40% of our population. That to me is terrifying. Now, I would say the election south of the border that elected the current president was probably the most important election in their history.
Mm-hmm.
And they only had a 60% turnout. So it didn't increase their voter turnout. That should give us some concern because I hope, and I have seen some indication that more people are engaged in this election than have been before. But I also suspect that people are going, okay, I've seen the polls, everything's going to be okay, or my vote doesn't matter. I mean, I've heard it all, but the truth of the matter is people are letting other people decide because they think their vote doesn't matter. They think they're maybe not smart. I had someone say to me recently they were not smart enough to vote. I went, oh, for heaven's sakes, I've met a lot of people are not as smart as you when they vote. So I think we have forgotten what our vote is, what our vote does. Right? It's
I hammer this point home. Yeah, I mean, I hammer this point home all the time. My daughter has a couple of friends who actually were afraid to tell me that they didn't vote in the last provincial election. And my words were, they should be afraid to tell me this. So I am tracking them down for this next one. You must vote. It is crucial. And I don't understand why people are so complacent about it. But I try to understand.
Yes.
And today, Nanos came out. We're talking about polls. They have the Liberals up by 8 points, which is a huge shift from the Conservatives. They had a 25-point lead in December, which is mind-boggling. You write about the danger of polling, though, in your book. How much do polls actually sway voter behavior, and should they be more tightly regulated, especially during elections?
I do think they should be more tightly regulated. And let me say something positive about polls, because when I started this book, I just wanted all polls, a pox on all of them, get rid of them. I don't like them anymore.
Right.
Because they've never really been helpful to me. But we have very good quality pollsters in this country. What we don't have is quality polling in every riding. And we elect our members of parliament, we're talking federal here, we elect our member of parliament in a riding. And so it's the polling in our riding that matters. Now we have lots of aggregators, 338, Eric Grenier in the Red. And what they do is they take all the good polls from across the country, they take a look at the history, the probability, and they put them together in an algorithm and they give you an outcome. So here's what people see. They see that little red line that goes up like this, and the little orange line that goes up like this, and the little blue line that goes up like this, and the little green line that's over here. And what they see is, oh, the Liberals are winning. And they don't ask themselves, or the Conservatives are winning, because it had been 2 months ago. And they don't ask themselves, what's the best situation in my riding? Or, oh, if the Liberals are winning, I better vote Liberal because I have to vote for a winner. We have decided in this country, the only vote that counts is the vote for a winner. And that is skewed, especially in an election like this, which I would say is a fear-based election. We are voting out of fear of what we don't want.
Absolutely.
And that is what has turned the polls around. We want something in particular. We want someone who's going to be calm and competent and a lot of things, but we don't want something else, right?
So people this is as much for what we don't want as much we want.
Right. And we've seen what happens, in the United States, and a lot of us don't want that. And yes, I don't blame us for not wanting that. So we know that it's important, but unfortunately what we are likely to do is create an imbalance so that we don't have, voices from smaller parties. Because if you look at these numbers, the NDP could get wiped out. Greens are struggling. Elizabeth May is struggling with a you must vote Liberal in her riding. I'll tell you, I know I have a Green background, but this country needs an Elizabeth May in the House of Commons.
Actually, Elizabeth May, listen, there's some real stars shining here. Elizabeth May, Charlie Angus.
Yes.
They have risen to the occasion right now.
Right. We're saying nice things about Doug Ford, and I haven't always agreed.
Forbid. I don't even know who I am anymore, but yes, I have agreed with Doug Ford on a couple of things. It's crazy.
So this is what I say. If you're in a riding where, it'd be obvious for me to say Green, but if you're in a riding, for example, where you have a New Democrat that you feel is if you were in Charlie Angus's riding, don't vote Liberal just because you feel you've got to be on the winning side. Vote for a Charlie Angus, right? Unfortunately, Charlie's not running.
He's retiring, sadly, but yes.
But you get my point.
Right.
I've been in a lot of ridings across the country, and what I am hearing is people going, well, I'd like to vote this way, but I'm going to vote Liberal because I have to stop the Conservatives. And I go, well, have you looked at what the chance is of your Conservative winning? And they go, well, yeah, but I can't take the chance. And I go, whoa. So I am a little concerned that rather than take our vote and say to ourselves, what do we want? And the reason I'm concerned, Candace, is because it ends up with voter remorse. So you end up voting for someone you sort of didn't want, but you didn't want someone else. And then you go, oh, but now the party that has this huge majority isn't doing what I like. And you don't have voices challenging, the government in power. And you have, which is what worries me, I see us going back to a two-party system. And Canada actually does much better when we have multiple voices in the House. So back to polls. How polls affect this is when polls are just the graphs, and we're not looking at the margin of error, and we're not looking at what went into it. The majority of voters just see the graphs. So I propose that at least we say, if your margin of error is greater than 4 or 5%, you can't publish. Now that, I think, would eliminate a lot of these polls that have an 8 and 9% margin of error, because all people see is, I mean, you think about it. If you're ahead by 8%, you could be up to 18 or down, another 8. That could change everything. But what the public sees is who's winning. And, I was in a riding in Halifax where the Liberals and the New Democrats were in a tie, according to the polls. They weren't in a tie. All the parties had done internal polling, and they knew there was no tie. But I had Green voters say, well, I can't vote Green because I want to break this tie. And I went, come on, you know who's in the lead here. Do you want to vote Green or not? And if you don't want to vote Green, that's fine. But they were letting the poll decide their vote. That's dangerous, letting a poll decide your vote.
So, this is going to push us into the next question, which is strategic voting, which we're seeing a lot of, particularly this election. And I think we're seeing so much of it because of what the big ballot question is, right? Do we want to be American or do we not? And it's not something I think a lot of Canadians really want to roll the dice on. They want certainty. In Ottawa, somebody who can push back and stand up to Donald Trump, which is, so I would say in other elections, maybe not as motivating, but certainly this election, we want to make sure we have the right people representing us.
We do.
Yeah. So you write about strategic voting, though, that it's a trap that undermines real democratic choice. But there are tools like smartvoting.ca, votewell.ca. They're becoming more popular because people want to avoid vote splitting, as we just said. So right now, for example, the NDP is projected to win just 6 seats, but without vote splitting, they'd actually win more. So for those trying to vote strategically to prevent an outcome they fear, how is that the wrong approach to end up with more seats for NDP?
So if the NDP gets more seats, especially in seats where they could defeat a Conservative, your NDP member is every bit as effective as a Liberal member, right? This is what we've lost sight of. And if the Conservative, so there are a few ridings where strategic voting will make a difference because the Conservative has a strong chance of winning. So there's your first question in your riding. Does the Conservative have a strong chance of winning? Who is another person who has a strong chance of winning? In some ridings, it's a New Democrat. In some ridings, it's a Liberal. In some ridings, it's a Green. Let's go back to Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May defeated a Conservative when she first won. Okay, and everyone told her she wouldn't win. The polls told her she wouldn't win because it was a cabinet minister. She won. And she has, I would say that her constituents would say she's been a good constituency MP. She's also been very good on the national stage. But there are people in her riding now who have voted Green all along, and they're going, I need to vote Liberal. The Liberal candidate hasn't even been named. They don't know who that person is. And I think there's where it gets skewed. Her riding is not going to change the outcome of who becomes government. Right? And this is what we have to stop and sort of go, whoa, just a minute. The other thing, Candace, and this is for the nerds out there, but it's really important, is if a candidate gets 10% of the vote in the riding, so 10% of the vote, so you could come second or third,
right?
They get 60% rebate of the money they spent in that election back.
Okay? That's huge.
That's huge. So say your cap was 100 and some thousand. Most candidates won't have spent that much, but you could get up to $50,000 or $60,000 back to help your party in that riding prepare for the next election. Finally, a party has to get over 2% of the vote to get a rebate on what they spent. Now you take, the NDP and the Greens, this affects them. If we don't get over 2% in the Greens, we get nothing back, right? So every vote does have some impact. The NDP were hit hard by the rebates when their vote share fell in the last election. It means they're less prepared to run this election. So we're actually making a determination for our next election if suddenly, we elect Liberals right across the country and nobody else. In New Brunswick in 1995, I think, Frank McKenna ended up with every seat in that legislature. There was no opposition. Well, I mean, the McKenna government was good for New Brunswick, but to not have any opposition, no one there who's holding you accountable, that's not how our democracy is meant to work.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm totally, I am Team Mark Carney. I am.
Yeah, okay.
But I would not want to see him unchecked.
No, no.
He has to
I
have an
don't think
opposition, a
he
healthy
wouldn't
one.
want, and he wouldn't want to be
Yeah,
unchecked. That's what
yeah,
we know
and
about Mark Carney, I think, is that, I mean, Mark Carney wants a form of majority government, but I think what Mark Carney wants is what's good for Canada right now. And that means a healthy
absolutely.
uh, environment in Parliament where things are debated, where people do talk about issues, where the committee, where much of the work is done, is when you see parties trying to work together to get the best legislation for the country. That's what I worry about, is that, and I have a lot of sympathy. I too want to ensure that we have a stable, capable leader in this country who can take on the challenges we're facing. And we are coming into a time when the world order is going to, I think you wrote about it in your latest blog. Our world order is about to change, and we need to be careful about who we have in leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people, though, the average voter, though, is also tired of what has become really not opposition politics, but obstructionist politics, where everything is voted against just because it's not their team. And I don't know how we get around that, but that in and of itself is exhausting, I think, for the average person, and why there is so much cynicism right now, because it almost seems like you have to have a majority government to get anything advanced in this country, which is also a little bit dangerous.
I talked about how party structures had surprised me when I started becoming an active politician. And, when you're a small party like the Greens, it's not that big a deal because you do work cooperatively. That's how you get things done. You depend
Right.
on the other parties, right? But what shocked me is how much discipline the Liberals and the Conservatives, even the New Democrats, have. You're told how you're going to vote. You can't vote against your own party. And a professor at Acadia University, Alex Marlin, has written a very good book called Whipped. It's very big and it's a bit academic, but it's really good. And he points out that we've had a dramatic change. It used to be if you were a backbencher in the Liberals or the Conservatives or the Democrats, you were allowed occasionally to go, I'm not voting with the party. I don't believe in
Right.
it, or I don't. And so it was cabinet and your front benches that you had to keep in line, especially if it wasn't a matter of money or a huge issue. For example, we were able to get our Canadian flag that we all love so much and we just celebrated 60 years of because Conservatives and Liberals decided to vote together
Right.
because both of their leaders wanted something else. And they said, we want the compromise, we'll vote together. That couldn't happen now. That
Right.
could not happen. That isn't good for democracy. That is not good for democracy. We have to take a look at how do we free up. And I know there's a lot of talk about free votes, but just taking away some of the ability for the leader must sign your nomination papers, for example. So if you don't do what they say, you won't be running in the next election. That that to me is really stifling our democracy. And and I think most people, I hate to say this, but most people probably go into the voting booth not knowing the name of the candidate, but knowing the party they want to vote for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and we're seeing that a lot right now, even just sort of leaking into the press this week, how conservatives are rumbling on the inside about how they can't say anything and they can't do anything right now within the Conservative Party. Some of them are even saying to the press that they're going to vote for Carney, which is unheard of. But yeah, I think it's been a pretty tough go under Polyev where they can't say anything.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And so
everything's
you're
for a viral moment, it seems, which is really
yes.
exhausting.
And it's only the people in Nepean are going to vote for Mark Carney, right? That's the
Yes,
only
that's
place he's
right.
on the ballot.
Yeah.
But we have felt the influence of the American system where they vote for a president. And we've lost sight of that. Like, I'd like to think we get the best people from across the country in the House of Commons. And and we've seen this, a lot of people have stepped forward to run because Mark Carney is leader. They weren't going to run under Justin Trudeau. So
Sean Fraser.
well, I know. I can joke because I happen to think Sean Fraser is a very effective MP, and I was disappointed when he stepped down to spend more time with his family. I guess Mark Carney has promised him more time with his family, but you know what I'm saying is these are people
Absolutely.
who felt I need to step forward because I want to be part of Mark Carney's team, and and that's not a bad thing. I think you should know who a leader is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in a riding that has, I think of a couple of ridings I know where they have very strong New Democrats. And I can think of a couple of ridings where they have very strong Greens. That grouping of Greens and New Democrats will make Mark Carney a better leader. and, and right now, I'd like to say I felt that way about the Conservatives, that they would be working towards that common goal. And I think a number of them would like to, but they have adopted a very American approach where they all have to sing from the songbook and there's only one song. That is being felt. I'm not saying other parties don't do it because they do, but they're doing it in such a way. I mean, I'm very upset that Pierre Poilievre is not allowing journalists to be on his plane, for example. Even though journalists pay for that, it's not a freebie.
Right.
But it means they don't get any spontaneous questions. They don't get to see anybody unbuttoned or laid back. And they're counting on people who don't have political experience to cover them on the ground, local. And look, I was a local reporter, not putting down local reporters, but you may not have the same background that someone who's a national reporter has, right? So I watch them controlling that narrative, even though they don't seem to know what the narrative is right now. And that worries me because in Stephen Harper's time, they didn't let anybody go to debates, for example. And some writings that hurt them, but other writings it didn't.
Right.
Like, there are things we should demand of someone who's going to be our MP, and I don't care what party they're with. You should demand certain things of someone who works for you.
Like security clearance. Sorry that I brought that up.
No, you know what? I think that I'm glad that's coming back as an issue. I think it's an issue that we very much, I mean, I know he says, when I'm prime minister, I get it automatically. And I'm going, I don't think I want you to have it automatically if you weren't willing to get it when we actually could check it.
Absolutely. That's something we need to be talking about in terms of reform moving forward on this issue, because I don't think a lot of Canadians had any idea that this was even possible, because it seems so ridiculous that you wouldn't get it until after you became prime minister. I mean, it seems to make sense you would be vetted entirely before that even happened.
Exactly. I mean, I can tell you that the Conservative Party vets its candidates. They make sure their candidates have a pretty high level of security checking. And his arguments about not getting it have been very weak. I mean, I'm not allowed to talk about what's in the documents when I've seen them. Yes, but you can work with other government officials to take action. I mean, he more or less says, I can't say nasty things about other people when I know them not to be true. That's pretty poor reason not to get your security clearance. Um, and I think he hoped that Canadians wouldn't care about that. But most of us have had to, pass some sort of, police check if we're going to go volunteer at our kids' school. Or I went to pick up my granddaughter the other day from the school break after school program, and I wasn't on the list. My goodness, I had to show them a documentation. We had to call the mom and dad, and good for them.
Yeah,
good for
the
them.
way it should be.
But I thought, what? So anyway, yes, he should get his security clearance, and that should be a reason people are uncomfortable with him being possibly our prime minister.
Well, I think it exposes, like I said, a little bit of a loophole there that I think most Canadians wouldn't have assumed would have been there. And that this should be immediately addressed by whoever who steps into the role next. I would hope that is addressed
there's also
quickly.
a loophole that a lot of Canadians assume isn't there, but they're starting to figure it out, is politicians do not fall under the Truth in Advertising Act.
Oh, we're getting to that. Don't get ahead of me. You can't get ahead of me, Joanne.
That one blows my mind.
You cannot get ahead of me because we have so much to get to.
Okay, back to you.
All right, well, okay, I'm going to take us back. This is going to be probably a two-parter. We're going to talk about the role of media. So let's talk about the CBC for a minute, because they have been the target of some anger recently, and I'm including myself in this, by the way. I was one of the people who was incensed that Ian Hannah-Mansing did a joint show with NPR. I was furious that they were even entertaining this question. Wrote a letter and everything. First time I had ever done that to the CBC. I was angry. And then we had Rosemary Barton with this question to Carney in England about his finances and her finding it hard to believe. Now, I am not a defund CBC person. I am absolutely against that. But I think when it comes to media, people tend to see the media shaping voter perception. And both the left and the right accuse the press of bias. So, I mean, it doesn't matter what side you're on. So this is kind of everybody gets to think about this. Do you think media coverage still informs voters, or is it fueling the disengagement and the division?
I think media coverage still informs voters. Does it have the immense power that it used to have? No, I don't think so. There are so many other factors that are coming in. And I would say that your outrage at the CBC, some of it may have come from the fact you're a shareholder, right? You're a shareholder in the CBC. And if you were a shareholder in Canadian Tire and they started carrying a product you didn't like, you would say something about that. So the one thing I can say about the CBC is you have an ability to make your upset known. There is an ombudsman that will take your complaint, not just the Canadian Broadcasting Commission, but an ombudsman for the CBC itself. And I can tell you, as someone who occasionally had people complain to the ombudsman, they take it seriously.
Oh, I received a reply.
Oh, good.
I was quite impressed. I have to say, I was impressed. I received a reply within, I believe, 48 hours of sending that email. And I know I wasn't the only one who sent an email.
No. And I think it will affect the future. Probably didn't affect that moment, right? But it will affect the future. It is a broadcaster that is held accountable. Is it perfect? No, it absolutely is not. I say in the book, and I have said for a long time, I've studied the CBC and public broadcasting around the world. It's going to cost $40 million, but CBC should be completely advertising free. Not on their podcasts, not on their website, not on their television. And the reason for that, it's twofold. I don't care how ethical you are, if you're receiving funding, it's going to have some impact on how you do things. Secondly, I don't think we should compete with private broadcasters. And that is one of the, I mean, to be honest, private broadcasters get a lot of federal money. Most of us do not realize how much money federal broadcasters get. And I'm not opposed to that. What I'm opposed to is we should leave the commercial field open for them. And then I think we would see less stress between private broadcasters and the CBC. So those are two things I think we could change. The other thing that I would like to see change is having a way, whether it's putting the budget for the CBC at arm's length, I mean, even further than it is now, or making it reliant on a fee that goes on your cell phone bill or something that it allows us to see where our funding is coming from and not make it totally politically dependent. Because I can tell you within the CBC, there's not a fear of offending those who fund you, because they've done lots of studies on how their bias is. You'll never see anybody keep their records more than the CBC. But you do worry about the government, the hand that feeds you. You don't want to bite it, right? Stephen Harper at one point wanted all CBC employees to sign a pledge that we would not offend the government. Now, we didn't sign it. We bound together and we didn't. But that possibility exists. So I would like to see there be some changes there. What I do think it gets lost in this is exactly what we were saying. Our newspapers now primarily are owned by Americans. We are seeing the other broadcasters, including podcasters, who are very influential now, being funded by organizations that are a bit hard to track sometimes. At least with the CBC, especially if they got the broadcast side of it out of advertising, you know you own them. You own them as a Canadian citizen. Mm-hmm. And that means you have some influence. And I think that's critical. So I think they have a role to play. I think they have a critical role in a country the size of ours, where, you know, if I turn on the news at 6 o'clock in Vancouver, my mother can hear the same newscast at 10 o'clock in Halifax, right? There's something to be said for that in a country this big. Like, I think the whole country for a while there was mad at Rosie Barton. That was a unifying thing.
Well, it's true. And I think, she's a person. She's a person. And I don't want to like beat up on her. Like, I think it sometimes, which is crazy. I think she tends to have a bias. But, that aside, I don't think she should lose her job. I don't think the CBC should be defunded. And I think
it's a discussion a lot of people someone needs to have with Rosie.
I think so. And I think the other thing too, though, is I think most people don't understand how crucial the CBC is to Canadians. And it's very much like, people who, we had an ice storm this weekend, for example, in Ontario. And, people in Ottawa were like, well, that was much ado about nothing, and of course, hundreds of thousands of people are living with damage now across Ontario. But because it didn't happen in their neighborhood, it was a nothing thing. And I think that's a little bit how people think about CBC. I don't need it. Why does this person in this remote community need it? Same with Canada Post. These things that people sort of, because it doesn't impact them.
I think you've just touched on something critically important. If you live in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, where you have a lot of media options, you might think, oh, I don't really need the CBC, right? But even if you live in Fredericton or I would say Halifax, you still need PEI as one of the most dedicated CBC listeners. Even for CBC TV, they have a huge audience. But I know that they're the number one radio show. They're also the number one radio show in Moncton and in Fredericton. And you know why that is? Because they're not getting that product from anybody else. And that's what you forget when you're in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. And but the other thing is, most of those major broadcasters are going to give you the stories from Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto. They're not going to give you the story from, Truro or, Gander, Newfoundland, unless, it's a post 9/11 story. And yet, for smaller regions of the country, that's how we stay connected. I need to know what's happening in Moncton if I live in Halifax. I want to know what's happening in Charlottetown. CBC provides that. And I think here's the thing about the CBC. The minute we lose it, we'll miss it. And then it will be very hard to recreate it. So I've often said to people when I worked at the CBC, you don't have to listen to me, but you have to believe in what I do. And I had one conservative from the Kootenays when I was the host of the afternoon show for all of BC but Vancouver. He said, I hate your show, Joanne. And I said, well, you really don't have to listen to it. He said, but I like listening to Peter Zosky was still on. I like listening to Morningside. I said, great. As long as you can find something to listen to on the CBC, I'm happy. You don't have to listen to my show. And he became quite a fond listener after that. But, I think that's how we have to see it. It's like a family. We don't have to like everybody in the family and what they're doing at that particular time, but they're still family. And the CBC,
yeah, I said something like that on social media, just as this whole sort of thing with Trump blew up, of him talking about taking over Canada and whatnot. I said, Canadians have a very brotherly and sisterly relationship with each other. We can call each other every name in the book, but you go after one of them and we're going to be right there. And then I said, by the way, have you met my big brother Quebec? Because that is exactly, what,
Right.
and look at who is more Canadian right now than Quebecers.
Whoa, they're right up there.
I'm cheering them on. They're making me cry. They're just being incredible right now. They are so incredibly patriotic. And I'm just so proud of them, really. It's just amazing.
I mean,
I want to learn French.
Yeah, I think, and I also think we have embraced each other and we know what our differences are, but we've said we have more in common. And I think if there's a silver lining to the person who's in the White House, it is that it has helped us take a look at who we are, why we value it. And I think times of crisis bring that out in all of us, right?
I agree. Okay, we've got a lot more to get to, so I don't want to linger too long on the media question, but I am curious your thoughts, because you mentioned that people are not aware of how much government funding goes to different media sources. What do you think about this government funding going to, say, somebody like Post Media, where it is, I believe, 75% owned by Chatham Asset Management, which is an American hedge fund company with right-wing leanings? What are your thoughts on that? Should we be controlling this a little more?
I think we have to sit down and reevaluate how we're funding journalism in this country and who is funding journalism. There was a very good program, and I'm hoping it continues, where they were funding individual reporters as opposed to giving the money to National Post. They were giving the National Post a reporter to work there, and an internship, basically paid. And I liked that idea because I think it means you have someone who's experiencing your newsroom, who's coming in with fresh eyes. And I think that was supporting small journalism across the country, as well as big journalism that's owned outside the country. I personally would like to see more, the funding tied more to ownership, and that if you're over 50% American owned, you don't qualify. Come on, that's not that hard.
That seems like a no-brainer to me.
That seems like a no-brainer to me too. But they didn't ask me to write the legislation. The other thing that
we're going to get that on our list, Joanne. We're going to make that afterwards. Yeah.
We're going to make that happen. The other thing I think we need to go back and take a look at is when we started, and I was in favor of taxing, the Facebooks and the Instagrams And they came back and said, then we're not going to pay for news.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't carry it. And some very recent studies have come out about the impact that has had on the news we get as Canadians. It's been very detrimental, very detrimental. So what do we do about that? I think we have to revisit how we fund that. And, we're fighting with the oligarchs again. But I do believe that the fact that people didn't notice when they lost, for example, CTV, CBC, and whatnot as sources on Facebook, they ended up with influencers and individuals who had no journalistic background whatsoever. And people don't notice the difference, right? Like they're still getting a column about somebody, but they don't know whether it's been properly researched and who's been putting it out. So I do think we're still figuring out this media landscape, the new media landscape, and it's here to stay. And in this election, we've seen a lot of misinformation and disinformation. I love the fact that the people who want to create false news stories take the CBC logo and stick it on there, right? Like, wow. So anyway, I encourage everyone, be diligent, take a look at where your news comes from. If it sounds like it shouldn't be true, it probably isn't. But yeah, I think we need to take our journalism funding and our journalism regulation and let's revisit.
Agreed. And let's hope that happens with this next government. So millions of Canadians aren't voting. I mean, I saw it represented in a pie chart where if, in Ontario recently, where if didn't vote was a party, it was actually the largest party, the winning party.
Your Ontario election was very disappointing.
Oh, well, I can't talk about it, Joanne. I'm still hurting from that.
45% turnout. 45%.
Devastating. It's devastating. And I don't understand it.
Well, okay. Ontario in the winter, I get some of that. Secondly, an election that no one felt was necessary. I know, Ford wanted a mandate and all that, but really, he had a majority government. I don't know how much more of a mandate he needed.
He wanted 4 more years.
Exactly is what he wanted. And you know what? Here's my argument throughout the book. People are smart enough to know that, right? They go, he wouldn't have called an election in February when he already has a majority if he didn't know if he could win. So they know he knows he can. Why should I vote? He's going to win. Like, that's how our thinking is. Like, they go, yeah, he's going to win. It's foregone conclusion. Why should I bother to vote?
See, but that's where I think people should say, knowing this, you would think they would say, I'm going to the polls and I'm going to kick this bum out. Like, that's what should have happened. I mean, my voter registration card came after the election.
Well, in Nova Scotia, because they were worried that we were going to have a postal strike, which we had, they didn't send out registration cards. Nova Scotia, which has traditionally been a high voter turnout, 45%. We were like Ontario because it was the 9th of December. All you're thinking of is getting ready for this holiday season. And snap election, so all the parties were, except for the Conservatives, were in disarray. Not on the fixed date that was the first piece of legislation this government had brought in. So people went, the polls have told him he's going to win. Why do I bother? 5% turnout.
I just don't know what to say because I'm a voter. I voted in every election. So I don't understand when people don't vote. And so you describe it as a gateway drug to deep.
It is a gateway drug.
Simple, tangible change that could start to bring people back in.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, and there are 2 things that are a bit controversial. Well, there's 1, 2 in the book. But I said them primarily because I want people to have a discussion. Like, come on, let's argue. So the first one is, if the turnout at the polls is less than 50%, you have to redo the election. Now, who wouldn't like that? So you'd be going to the polls again in New Ontario, and we'd be going again in Nova Scotia.
I would love that only because it is a drug to me. I love the smell of democracy in the morning. Sign me up. I am there.
So, and I say that because I know the parties wouldn't want that, right? And I know it's expensive and it's a lot of things. So we might have to have some rules around it that you drop off anyway. But if it's that low, you don't have a mandate. You don't. I mean, even in first past the post, we ask everyone to get 50%. Okay, so that's the first one. The second thing, and this is back to your gateway drug, I want to lower the voter age to 16. And I get there's lots of people who disagree with me on that one, and we should have that discussion. But I have a very strong reason for doing it. I feel it has to go hand in hand with compulsory civics education in the schools. So you cannot lower a voting age and not teach them about our democracy. But you do, the science is clear. If you vote in the first election you're eligible for, you will vote in every election thereafter. If you miss the first election you're eligible for, you don't vote in every election thereafter. We have lost that generation. You wrote in your recent blog about your grandmother and how you wondered what it was like when she heard that the Second World War was coming to an end. My mother was a child during the Second World War, and when she first started to vote, you had to be 21. My mother has never missed an election. Neither, by the way, Mom. But she's never missed an election. So when I was writing the book, I asked her, well, why do you feel so strongly? She's not a terribly political person. She goes, Joanne, I had friends and relatives that died in that war so we could vote. I will vote no matter what. She's 92 years old. I got her to the polls for the last note. She was one of that 45% that voted in Nova Scotia. We're losing that connection to the fact that our vote could disappear, because most of us, our parents would have told us that story, and we've probably told our kids and grandchildren, but it's not really very real to them. What is happening in Ukraine and maybe in the United States may change that. I hope it does. I hope people realize that their vote could disappear. It could disappear. And if you realize that, you think, oh, well, maybe I should vote. But I am worried that the value of the vote is being lost. And so I want us all to commit to raising voters and doing whatever it takes. I mean, women, this podcast, women forget that, it wasn't that long ago we weren't allowed to vote. They debated it for years that we would ruin the country if we were allowed to vote. We should never take it for granted.
You're going to pull me off on a tangent here. You have to stop, because honest to God, we could run things if we voted.
We could.
We could be running everything right now if we were actually voting. It is one of the most frustrating things for me is, talking to people who don't vote. And I hope people right now are zooming out a little bit to understand the connections with Ukraine, for example, and Russia invading, and how that all started as jokes, and questioning their sovereignty and are they a real country. This was the same verbiage used there that we are seeing being used to the south of us right now. And I want people to notice that, because this is why it is so crucial to be voting, and to be voting at every level, right down to your municipal level. We are seeing people in municipal elections, on school boards who are pushing anti-trans agendas and things like this. Very American million moms BS coming into the Canadian system at the local level. And I think most people are just sleepwalking right through that. So I really do hope people will wake up. I just don't know what it's going to take for them to do that.
And I think they have to start seeing that vote as a superpower. Like, I have a colleague in New Brunswick who won her election by 11 votes. 11 votes.
Crazy.
Think about that. Were you one of those 11 people who took a chance and voted for her? If you are, you got her in. And maybe those 11 people who didn't want her to win should have gone and voted. They didn't. Here's another thing that makes me stop and think. So the majority of people who were part of the riot that stormed the Capitol in the United States on January 6th didn't vote. Now,
What?
they
What?
did not vote.
Okay, I had not heard that. That is fascinating.
That is
Wow.
fascinating to me too, because what it says to me is they've given up on the democratic system, right? They didn't vote. I think we should be listening to that because, and this comes back to political parties and the way we've kind of not rigged the system, but made the system work for us, right? Um, yes, I think a first past the post system right now makes it harder for someone to feel their vote is important. But okay, let's assume that's a long-term plan. We're not going to change that before the 28th of April. But what we could change is how about making voting day, no matter what level it's at, a holiday? Like,
Yes.
why in the world do we say we give you 4 hours to vote and someone says, well, you get off at 6 and the polls are open to 8, so I don't have to only have to give you 2 hours to vote, right? Like, let's give everybody a holiday. Let's say voting is that important that you should get a day off. And except for essentials, you can't have businesses open. Secondly, why don't we make it a bit of a celebration? So let's get the school boards and the nonprofit organizations cooking up food and having tables for vendors so that people can come and bring their kids and eat. And when you vote, why don't they have an incentive? At the national level, they could give you a day pass to the national park, right? Like, why aren't we doing those things? Give them ice cream. As I said, look, don't even make it day passes. Give them ice cream and some people will come and vote. But the truth is we've made voting kind of boring, right? They have a yellow sign and you go to the school and you have to get your name taken. And there's nothing wrong with that. We should do all of those things. But there should be some fun connected to it. And I think that's part of it. I do think we need to start celebrating voting. In Australia, and everyone talks about Australia, but there are many countries that have compulsory voting, but Australia does. You have to vote in Australia. You don't get a choice. Well, you have to show up the polls. You're allowed to not mark your ballot. You can put it in. But it is a national holiday. It's on a Saturday. You're encouraged to bring the kids and have barbecues and whatnot. Their voter turnout is 92%.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
So I think we need to start with the simple things,
That's
right?
fantastic.
The simple things about free buses so that people can get there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just think we've made voting something that hides away. We don't talk. I guess in certain circles we talk about it all the time. I could talk about voting till the cows come home, but I think we're not saying to people, this matters, your vote matters. And you're allowed to go vote for what you want. I run into so many teenagers who are out marching in the streets for things, and they don't realize that, yes, keep doing that. That's very important. But if you don't vote, your marching in the streets isn't going to get you there.
Oh, so we're finally gonna go back to the discussion about lying.
My favorite.
You're going to love it. You're going to jump right into this, I'm sure of it. So this is something that really insults voters, I think, is when politicians lie. It's this blatant mistruths with no consequences. And even loyal party supporters often feel like they have to swallow the lie to keep things moving along. Then the promise gets broken and we all look the other way. It's a little dance we do. And so do you think this collective complicity is part of what's eroding faith in democracy? I mean, we kind of, when we're very partisan, we do tend to get sucked into the lies. We defend them almost because we need to maintain that, liberal or conservative or NDP. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think this is becoming a chronic problem. And we have a very loose connection to the truth these days. Um, and I, yes, I understand that someone can make a political promise and then when they get into power, discover there were things they didn't know. There were circumstances that they had to deal with. But just breaking the promise, it just makes people so cynical. So in 2015, Justin Trudeau, who was the head of the Liberal Party, said 1,200 times that this would be the first election, the last election under first past the post. He was going to change electoral reform. And he set up a committee and they did the research and blah, blah. And then he said, oh, I don't think Canadians want that anymore. Well, first of all, they didn't check with Canadians. I mean, I know they had a sort of weak survey. And they walked away from it. And when I was knocking on doors in that election, I had people who said to me, I will vote for you the next time because the next time will be under a new electoral system. And I have to vote Liberal this time so we can get a change. A lot of people with Fair Vote Canada, there's a chapter in the book about that. Someone who I know believed very deeply and gave up the last months of her life to fight for them. And then they just walked away and there were no consequences. None. So should that be allowed? I don't think so. I think we need to have something in the Elections Act where every promise needs to be registered. I would like to see them costed, but I can live with having the promises registered. And if you've registered it and you win, you must at least account to Elections Canada when you meet that or what stage you're at, so that people can check on it and people can hold you accountable. Because there's the fixed election date. I don't want to pick on Liberals, so let's talk about Stephen Harper. He brought in the fixed election date legislation because he said it is unfair what we do now. It gives all the power to the party who calls the election. We need to level the playing field. Oh, his speech is eloquent. And within a year, he called an election and broke his fixed election date act. You think people don't get cynical? Sure they do. As I said, Canadians are smart. Voters are smart. But after a while, they go, well, not much I can do about that. Or as you say, if, conservatives went, well, we needed this election. Well, what about believing in fixed election dates? Oh, well, yeah, next time. And the same thing happened with the Liberals. I mean, in British Columbia, the NDP had made a commitment to change the electoral system. And then they brought in all kinds of restrictions on the vote, and it didn't happen. And so I think what I'm saying is, yes, you're right. People decide, they can say anything they want when they're running for office, but there's nothing to keep them accountable. And they're probably right. So, I said to you earlier, and I'm going to repeat it because it just blows my mind. So we have a Truth in Advertising Act in Canada. So if you have a hand cream and you say it'll take away your chapped hands and then it doesn't, you can actually have that advertising changed. We've seen advertising challenged, and people have to pay great fines for lying in an ad. Politicians do not fall under that act. They are an exemption to the act. You have to ask yourself why. Why wouldn't they?
Are there any countries out there who are addressing this very issue or have fail-safes in place for this kind of thing that we could model or look towards?
Well, I'm going to give New Brunswick some credit here. They've just started in New Brunswick. The last election was the first time it was in place, where any promise that is made, if it's made by the leader or the party and they have time frames, has to have the costing posted. So you can't go out and say, or you have to say, and this is the little bit of a note, but it means other parties can point to it. We don't know how much it's going to cost. Okay? Well, if you're going to put a doctor in every community and you don't know how much that's going to cost, I don't believe you're going to do it, right? So at least, to be honest, I was in New Brunswick for the last election. It's a lot of work to cost everything. And I'm not sure enough people looked at it, but it's a start. You have to be careful if you're going to promise something And it means that after the election, the opposition parties and interest groups and whatnot can go back and look at that costing and look at what you promised, because it's not just the costing that's there. It's, if you promised a bridge to that community and you put the cost in, that community can hold you to that, right? So it's a start. I don't think they've put all the pieces in. It's a start.
I want to go back to the media on this question because, and more so traditional media, because, like I can sit here and tell you, I'm a liberal voter. I'm going to vote Carney. Nobody's surprised to hear this out of my mouth. Like I have my whole website is what she said. It's feminist, it's liberal, it's left leaning. There's no surprise here. But for somebody like the CBC or Global News or I don't know, Globe and Mail, those institutions, I suppose, what is their obligation in this? Because it feels like the media, I don't know, they're not complicit, but they play a role, certainly, in normalizing that kind of dishonesty, which is something we have seen play out hugely in the United States. As it was pointed out, Kamala Harris had to be flawless and Donald Trump got to be lawless. And it was just this false equivalence given to both candidates. There were fine people on both sides, that kind of thing. So where does the media have a responsibility to voters in this? Like for example, with Pierre Poilievre refusing to get his security clearance. Is the media paying enough attention to that story? For me, I think he shouldn't even be able to run. But I don't think the media is even talking about it enough.
Well, and we know about it because of the media. I will give us that. We know about it because of the media. And I think the lack of reporters and resources in mainstream media is going down all the time, right? It's a David and Goliath situation.
Right.
The influencers and the people who have platforms who can get information out, it's just not even a fair fight. So I do believe there is responsibility. And sometimes I think the media is not trying too hard, is being held to too high a standard. Because the minute you are accused of being biased in the media, somebody's going to come after you, one side or the other. I used to say, if I'm making both sides mad, I'm probably doing my job right? Yeah. But that's hard too, because they're so sensitive that sometimes, how do I put this politely? Sometimes they go overboard to be fair. And as I say, somebody who isn't being truthful doesn't deserve as much airtime as someone who is, in my opinion. However, there's such an effort to try and balance and to have a criteria for balancing that mainstream media is hamstrung. But Buddy on TikTok's not. He can just go. There's a chapter in the book about Poilievre getting mad at the media and taking on David Akin. David Akin, who's been covering politics for a long time. He accused him of being a heckler and a liberal supporter. But then he put out a wonderful, Mr. Poilievre did, fundraising letter that said, people who want inflation to go down, out of control spending to end, the CBC to be defunded, and all the hurt caused by Trudeau turned into hope for a better future. We can't count on the media to communicate our message to Canadians. We have to go around them and their biased coverage. Now, that was a piece of mail that went to every Conservative supporter. And sure, not everybody's going to believe that. But that's someone who's running to be Prime Minister who says we have to go around the media. And when you're the clips were picked up by a lot of TikTokers. One in particular I contacted and asked, why did you choose that clip? Because the TikTokers were making it look like David Akin was a plant from the Liberals, which he wasn't.
Right.
And that they were all taking on Pierre Poilievre. It was, in my opinion, a very untrue story, the way they presented it. And this person got back to me. He's a truck driver, right? Has an interest in politics, and there's nothing wrong with that. but he doesn't have a journalism education. He hasn't been held accountable. When I would put a story out, I would have to put it through an editor, right? He doesn't have to do any of that. And he had more followers than you could shake a stick at, and he was making money on
That's a whole other podcast, honestly,
it. Is.
because they
But
just tell
that's what
lies
we're
to
up
make
to.
money. They
Yeah,
just
tell
tell
lies
lies
to
to
make
make
money.
money.
Yeah.
That's why I don't make any money doing this.
Yeah, you don't tell any lies. Well,
But don't lie to people. I'm not sensational enough. I just want to get information to people. And
exactly.
that is the whole problem with this ecosphere that we're working in, is that it pays people who are outrageous, who tell lies, who fudge the truth a little bit. That is just the nature of this beast, and that's something that I don't know how we contain it.
Well, the other thing that I want to add about the guy on Twitter who his title was Clyde Do Something, and Clyde Do Something never gave me his real name, and he refused to. So he wasn't accountable to anybody.
Yeah, anyway, that's crazy. That's crazy. Okay, so you've run in multiple federal elections. Yes. How has the tone of politics changed since you entered public life? Because I remember when conversations about politics didn't suck the oxygen out of a room. but now people can barely get through dinner with family members. Politics is very polarizing anymore. So what's changed?
Yeah, a lot has changed. Even in the decade since I first ran for office, I used to have back in 2015 what I called kitchen table talks, and I would ask people to invite 10 people from their neighborhood, and I would go over and say, "Here's your chance to get to know me. Ask me questions," And those were very civil. People agreed to come. I was talking to a candidate recently about that, and they said, "You know what? I don't know if they'd be safe right now." That is scary, right? Very. That is scary. But I do find that when you turn it down and just say you want to listen more, listening is a lost art. You probably know this. You're a professional listener. Some people just want to be heard. And I think they think shouting will help. And that's my worry. I think too many politicians aren't listening. And I put that on the candidates and politicians. We've got to listen. We've got to hear the hurt people are feeling. We've got to get a little closer to their pain and not offer to fix it all, because no politician is going to do that. But I think, I look at whether the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, where everyone just sat and laid on their horns, to me, it became very symbolic of a group of people who I don't think were as homogeneous as we thought they were. I think they came from a lot of, I don't think they had any idea the manifesto that the organizers were in charge of, but they had just felt, nobody's hearing me. Nobody knows how I feel. So I worry about this, because when you tell somebody, I'm thinking of voting Liberal or Green, they look at you like you've got, if they're a Conservative, for example, they look at you like you're a crazy or you're part of the problem, and then that sort of starts. I personally think that that tone comes from the top. Again, hate to blame it all on the administration, but the 2016 Trump started it, where it was okay to be rude, to be disrespectful. I don't know how anyone could have watched Zelensky and Trump and Vance in the Oval Office and not felt like, what has our world come to? Civility and respect have been cornerstones in having a political discussion. And we need to get back to that. And I do think, and I am going to point a finger here, that Mr. Poilievre decided that was the tone. He's taken that tone for a long time in the House of Commons, but there was kind of people knew what was going on there, and they were willing to fight that. But when he took it public and started giving everyone a nickname and making fun of people, it unleashed a type of political discourse that's very hard. It's like putting the toothpaste back in the tube. We're having trouble getting people to going back to a time where you respected those who didn't agree with you. You didn't have to agree with them, right? My grandmother, my grandfather died when I was quite young, and my grandmother wanted to remarry. She lived in PEI. A longtime friend, farmer, who came over every day and sat in her front room and read the newspaper. And one day I said to her, Nanny, why don't you just marry Herbie? And she said, well, he's a conservative, honey. I can't marry him. And I said, oh, really? That's me. She said, yes. You know, my grandmother was a liberal. And then they eloped a couple of years later. And I said, Nanny, did you convince him to vote liberal? She goes, no, we just decided we could have 2 signs at the end of the driveway. I think we need to decide in Canada that it's okay to have multiple signs at the end of the driveway. It's time we stopped hating each other and realized we're better together, you know?
I think, just a little story, from my perspective, is my grandfather was a conservative through and through. He voted blue his entire life. He never voted anything else, wouldn't even consider it. I think he'd be rolling over in his grave right now to see what the Conservative Party has become. I have voted Conservative in my life many times. NDP, Green, Liberal. I have voted all over the map, in my voting life. And, but it has become so polarized right now that I couldn't even consider it, because I think it has become so, I guess I want to say dirty, but I also want to say juvenile on the one side of things. And we're seeing that contrast play out right now in real time, which is why I think we're also seeing this massive swing, because it's not just Trump. It's that we're seeing an adult in the room, with real solutions who can help us through this very trying time, I think. So,
well, as someone has said, we want an adult. We have someone who's calm, competent, and realizes, and maybe we hearken back to, that's what politics was at one time, right? Like, we had fiery orators. I mean, Tommy Douglas was a fiery speaker. Diefenbaker was a fiery speaker, and the first Trudeau was a fiery speaker. Like, we've had colorful politics, but you're right. I think right now, Canadians are going, we are facing a challenge to our sovereignty. We are facing a very difficult economic time. And the time for games is over. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like everyone was treating it like a game, and it's a very serious game. I think we need people who understand the consequences and who have come into public life for the time. That was the way politics was designed originally, that you volunteered for public service for a time. It wasn't even a full-time career. Yes, if you were a civil servant, it could become a full-time career. But politicians were for a time in your life. I think we're looking for a politician for the time.
I agree. So your book offers a lot of actions to reboot Canadian democracy. So if you could only implement just one before the next election, you've only got a month. You better get cracking. Come on. What would it be?
Okay, it's a really boring one. I would bring back the per vote subsidy. It's something that Stephen Harper got rid of. And until we have a proportional form of representation, I think the one thing that was valuable is that every vote was worth about $1.50, $1.60. And it's not anymore. There's no money federally for a vote, except for those rebates I told you about. So you have to raise the money, use the money, and then get the money back. And that really favors parties that have big organizations and raise a lot of money. And let's be honest, that's the Liberals and the Conservatives. If like 1 million people voted Green in 2015 and we got 1 seat, but those 1 million people was $1 million that went into the party funds to help the party build for 2019. And I think if we want a robust political environment where people have discussions and then we need to say we're going to provide some funding for that. So I would bring back the per vote subsidy. Now, how boring is that?
I love that you had that answer right on the tip of your tongue. That's amazing. So let's close it out then. If somebody is listening right now, they feel like their vote doesn't matter, they're cynical, they're tired, what would you say to them?
Vote. I don't care if you go, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to count to 5 and pick a number and vote. Go vote. You know, they used to say if you don't vote, you can't complain. Well, that's not true because all of us complain. But if you don't, I think voting makes you care. I know I don't have science to back that up, but it's like being in a hockey pool. If you have, you know, a bunch of players on your dream hockey team, you suddenly care who scored the goals last night. If you go in and vote, even if the person you voted for doesn't win, you care about the person who won and what they do. Right. And they have to account to you. So vote, no matter what. Vote early if you can't be there on election day. If I say to women, take somebody with you, an aunt, a grandmother, a child who can't vote. Make your vote influence someone else in that you've taken them to vote. So go vote.
And take a first-time voter with you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I really mean it. Storm the ballot box. Because, you know, someone said, well, you stormed the Capitol. I said, but if we stormed our ballot boxes, we don't even know what it would mean. We don't. Let's find out. Anyway.
I agree.
I'm on a crusade.
I love it. I love it. I hope I can help push this out further for you, Joanne. This is great. You're so energetic. I loved all the points you made. I really, really do hope we have a better turnout. I'm going to connect with you when we find those numbers.
When we get the numbers,
we'll have a discussion. All right.
Thanks
wonderful.
So much. Thanks, Candace. It was a great conversation.
It was a pleasure, Joanne. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, wait 1 second. I'm going to stop it. I just want to make sure you're totally...